Kash Patel walked into the grand hall of the studio with a quiet resolve, the air thick with anticipation. The cameras were already rolling, the lights were blinding, and the audience, carefully chosen for this high-profile public forum, waited expectantly. This was meant to be another one of those judiciary panels aired in prime time, restoring trust, government, justice, and transparency in 2025. On the surface, it was a simple discussion about the state of the nation's justice system, but Kash knew better. It wasn't just a forum. It was a trap. As the newly appointed director of the FBI, Kash had spent the last few months getting acquainted with his new role. He had inherited a broken agency, plagued by corruption and long-standing political interference. But this would be the moment to set the stage for real reform. If there was one thing he had learned during his time working with national security and legal reforms, it was that the truth always came out in the end. His job was to make sure it came out on his terms. Kash could feel the eyes of millions of people on him. The room buzzed with an energy that threatened to explode. His opponent tonight was none other than Judge Isaac Hawthorne, an influential figure in the judiciary with deep political ties. For years, Judge Hawthorne had been an untouchable figure, wielding his power from behind closed doors, steering the course of federal investigations to protect his allies. But now, Kash Patel was standing in his way. He wasn't just going to expose Hawthorne's corruption, he was going to tear it down piece by piece. When Kash stepped on stage, he was greeted by a forced handshake from Judge Hawthorne. The judge's smug smile barely concealed his disdain. The tension was palpable. Kash took his seat calmly, undeterred by the theatrics of the show. He was used to this. He had faced down enemies in far more dangerous places than this, and tonight would be no different. His mission was simple, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The moderator, Catherine Roberts, began the panel with the usual pleasantries, introducing the purpose of the forum, a public discussion on government justice and transparency. But Kash knew this was just the prelude to what was coming. The real question tonight wasn't about the FBI's reforms, it was about power, accountability, and the system that had long operated in the shadows. Judge Hawthorne, seated across from Kash, wasted no time. His first salvo came quickly. "Director Patel," he said with an icy smile, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "your leadership has raised many concerns. You've overhauled protocols, replaced regional chiefs, and launched reviews into what you call political lawfare. What you're doing looks like a purge. Are you running the FBI, or are you weaponizing it?" The audience gasped. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the tension in the air. The words hung heavy, like a challenge thrown across the table. Producers in the control booth whispered to the anchors, expecting Patel to stumble, to backpedal, to soften his stance. They didn't know Kash Patel. He opened the folder in front of him, a simple gesture that seemed almost deliberate. Calmly, he looked at Judge Hawthorne. "Your Honor," Kash said with unwavering clarity, "you want to talk about weaponization, then let's talk about you." Judge Hawthorne's expression faltered for a brief second. It was barely perceptible, but Kash caught it. The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension shifted. The judge's eyes narrowed, his earlier bravado slipping for a moment. It was a mistake, and Kash knew it. This wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a reckoning. Kash slid the first document across the polished desk toward the judge. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. The camera zoomed in on the letter, and Kash's calm voice filled the room. "Do you recognize this letter, Your Honor?" Judge Hawthorne glanced at it and scoffed. "I've reviewed thousands of judicial correspondences in my career," he said dismissively, attempting to regain control. Kash didn't let him. "It's dated March 4th, 2020, from your chambers to the Deputy Attorney General," Kash continued, his voice steady. "It recommends preemptive federal scrutiny of political groups not yet under investigation based on emerging ideological alignment. You pushed for covert surveillance of conservative veterans groups during an election cycle before a single charge was filed. You argued they were likely to escalate based on their rhetoric and online posture. You called it preventative justice." The room went cold. The shift was undeniable. The audience was in shock, some even recoiling at the audacity of the accusations. Judge Hawthorne's smug demeanor evaporated, replaced by the first hints of panic. Kash didn't stop. He leaned forward slightly, his tone never wavering. "You're telling me I'm weaponizing the FBI? You're the one weaponizing the justice system, Your Honor. You've been using your position to suppress investigations, protect your political allies, and intimidate those who dare to challenge the status quo. And now, you want to talk about my leadership." Judge Hawthorne's throat tightened. He reached for his water, but his hand shook as he grasped the glass. His calculated deflection was no match for the steady assault of evidence that Kash Patel was laying down. For a moment, the room was eerily quiet. Kash's calm, methodical approach had turned the tables entirely. The audience, which had come to see a political spectacle, was now witnessing something far more significant, the beginning of a reckoning. Kash Patel wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the rot. And tonight, Judge Isaac Hawthorne was the first target. The silence in the studio was deafening. The camera lights seemed to burn brighter, and the audience was frozen, unsure of how to react. The producers in the control room scrambled, unsure whether to cut to a commercial break or let the moment play out. But they didn't need to worry about the script anymore. Kash Patel had just rewritten it. Kash Patel's steady gaze remained locked on Judge Isaac Hawthorne as the audience absorbed the weight of his words. No one had expected this. What was supposed to be a calculated political showdown had turned into something entirely different, a moment of truth that couldn't be ignored. Judge Hawthorne sat motionless, his earlier bravado now replaced with a quiet, palpable tension. His hand hovered over the water glass, but he didn't drink. He couldn't. The floor beneath him had shifted, and he knew it. Kash didn't pause for long. He wasn't finished. He pulled out another sheet of paper from his folder and slid it across the table to the judge. This, he said, is a campaign donation dated 6 months before the 2020 election. It's from your family trust to a super PAC running attack ads against former administration officials. It's registered under your wife's name, same address. Tell me, Judge Hawthorne, how exactly is this not a conflict of interest? Judge Hawthorne's face drained of color as his eyes darted to the paper in front of him. He knew exactly what Kash had just presented, a document that laid bare his political involvement, something he had carefully hidden behind a wall of legal jargon and public service. This was no longer about courtroom strategies or legal battles. This was about the truth coming to light in a way he couldn't control. Kash's voice was quiet but commanding as he continued, "You've been accusing me of weaponizing the FBI. Well, let's talk about what you've weaponized. You've weaponized your position on the bench to further your own political goals, using your power to silence opposition and manipulate the system. You've used your judicial authority to protect your political allies and target anyone who dared to challenge the status quo." The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. A few college students exchanged nervous glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. Even the tech analysts and legal reporters were stunned, unable to process what was unfolding before them. Kash Patel wasn't just defending his actions. He was methodically taking down a figure who had been untouchable for decades. Judge Hawthorne's jaw clenched. His composure was slipping with every word Kash spoke. The weight of his own actions, the very things he had long hidden behind a mask of judicial independence, was crashing down on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For a moment, the judge tried to recover. "This is a coordinated attack, Mr. Patel. You've come here with premeditated intentions to smear my reputation and undermine the integrity of the judiciary," he said, his voice now trembling. Kash leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the judge's. "You want to talk about coordinated attacks, Your Honor?" Kash's voice grew steady, almost cold. "Let's talk about the email you sent to your clerk in 2020, requesting expedited coordination between your chambers and outside political advocacy groups. You used your position to suggest the strategic targeting of political dissidents, not based on evidence, but based on ideology. And this, right here," Kash said, pointing to the email in front of him, "this is the proof." The room seemed to hold its breath again. Judge Hawthorne's face went pale as Kash laid the evidence out for all to see. The internal email, the politically charged coordination, the illegal targeting, all of it was now official, entered into the record. There was no denying it. "You've manipulated the system, and now the truth is coming for you," Kash continued, his voice never faltering. "The real reason I'm reforming the FBI is not because of what's been done to me or the agency, it's because of what people like you have done to this country. You've allowed power to be misused in ways that hurt the very people you claim to serve. You've let political influence dictate what should be impartial justice." At this, the studio's tension reached a breaking point. The silence in the room was now joined by gasps from the audience, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Kash Patel had done more than just expose a corrupt judge. He had exposed a system that allowed such abuse to thrive. And all of it was being broadcast live for millions of Americans to see. Judge Hawthorne's hands trembled as he picked up the resignation letter, trying to gather himself. "This is slander," he managed to say, his voice growing desperate. "I demand you take back these allegations. You can't just accuse me." "No, Your Honor, I can't demand that you take back your actions, because your actions are on the record now. They're in the public eye, and there's no going back from that. You've weaponized the justice system for too long, and now it's over," Kash said, his words sharp as a scalpel. "And if that's slander, then it's the kind of slander that we need more of in this country. The kind that exposes corruption, that calls out abuse, that forces us to face the truth." Kash paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. He could feel the power shifting in the room, not in his favor, but in the favor of truth. The entire narrative of the evening had shifted, from a battle between two individuals to a battle between truth and the power that had long been hidden. With one final, unflinching look at Judge Hawthorne, Kash spoke again. "The real reason you don't want transparency in the FBI is because it would expose people like you. And that's the part we're changing." As the camera zoomed in on Kash, the finality of his words echoed across the room. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a moment that would reverberate across the nation, one where the truth was no longer something to be hidden. It was now a weapon, one wielded by Kash Patel, the man who would not let the system protect those who had long abused it. The broadcast didn't end with applause or cheers. It ended with a stunned, almost reverent silence as millions of Americans processed what they had just witnessed, a man, calm and composed, bringing the truth to light in a way that would forever change the conversation around justice and accountability in America. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the silence in the room seemed to stretch endlessly. In the control room, producers frantically began to assess the situation. What had just transpired was no longer part of the scripted forum. It was a political earthquake. Kash Patel had set the stage for a seismic shift, and the aftershocks were just beginning. Judge Hawthorne sat motionless, his hands still trembling around the water glass. The composed figure, who had once walked into courtrooms with the weight of unquestioned authority, now appeared small, vulnerable. His earlier attempts to maintain control had failed, and the documents Kash had laid out, each one revealing a new layer of corruption, had left him exposed in front of the nation. His career, carefully crafted over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. Kash, meanwhile, remained unfazed. His demeanor, calm as ever, never wavered. He had not come here to win a debate. He had come to destroy the carefully constructed facade that had protected people like Judge Hawthorne. And now, with the truth in the open, it was impossible to hide. The room was filled with a growing tension, the air thick with disbelief. The audience, once primed to see Kash Patel under fire, now found themselves witnessing something far more explosive, the unraveling of a powerful man and an entire system built on secrecy and manipulation. For a moment, Judge Hawthorne tried to recover. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "This isn't how we do things, Mr. Patel. You've turned this forum into an attack, a personal vendetta. You've disregarded the very principles of judicial integrity that this panel was meant to represent." Kash Patel raised a hand to silence him, and the effect was immediate. The judge, for all his pomp and authority, was no longer in control. Principles of judicial integrity? Kash's voice was ice cold, and it cut through the air like a knife. Tell that to the people you've manipulated, the citizens whose rights you've trampled on in the name of power. Tell that to the whistleblowers whose voices you silenced. You're not the protector of justice, Your Honor. You've been its greatest enemy. The finality of Kash's words hit like a sledgehammer. The judge's face grew pale, his mind racing for a response, but nothing came. The weight of the accusations was too much. The pieces were falling into place, and Judge Hawthorne knew that he couldn't stop the dominoes from toppling. Your Honor, you wanted to talk about weaponization? Kash continued, his voice steady but full of conviction. Let's talk about what you weaponized. You weaponized the very trust people place in their courts. You used the law as a tool to protect your political allies and crush anyone who dared challenge you. You're not just a judge, you're a political operator, hiding behind a robe. The cameras caught the judge's growing panic, the realization that his career, his legacy, was being torn apart by a single man. The room had grown colder, and the atmosphere was no longer one of debate. It was a trial, and Judge Hawthorne was in the defendant's seat. Kash reached into his folder once again, pulling out the final document, the one he had been saving for this moment. It was a thick report, heavily redacted, but its contents were clear enough to expose the judge for the orchestrator of a political agenda masked as judicial oversight. This, Kash said as he slid the document across the table, is a report from a whistleblower within your own chambers. It details the illegal coordination between your office and political advocacy groups, who were targeting dissenters within your jurisdiction. The whistleblower's report names specific individuals you had targeted, all in an attempt to suppress opposition to the political agendas you personally supported. Judge Hawthorne's face turned a sickly shade of green as he glanced at the report. His shoulders slumped as his carefully constructed defense disintegrated. His ability to argue, to deny the allegations, had evaporated. The evidence was irrefutable. "Are you denying it, Your Honor?" Kash asked, his voice quiet but piercing. "Or are you finally ready to admit that the system you've protected is broken beyond repair?" The judge remained silent. His gaze dropped to the document in front of him, and for the first time, the facade of power he had worn for so long seemed to collapse under the weight of truth. His inability to respond to the evidence was the moment the room realized something important. The system had just been exposed. Kash Patel had done more than just confront the judge. He had confronted an entire system of political manipulation hidden within the judiciary. The revelations were damning, and there was no going back. The documents on the table weren't just pieces of paper, they were the death knell of the old system. A murmur rippled through the audience. People were shifting in their seats, eyes wide with shock. The reporters, who had been prepared for a sensationalized battle, now found themselves faced with something far more profound: the public unmasking of corruption within the highest echelons of the judiciary. Kash's calm demeanor remained unbroken, but the impact of his actions was undeniable. The judge was no longer just a man being exposed, he was a symbol of the broken system that Kash was determined to dismantle. "Judge Hawthorne," Kash said, his voice firm but measured, "the truth is out. Your reign is over. The American people deserve more than a judicial system that operates in secrecy, where those in power are allowed to hide behind their robes. This system needs to be rebuilt, brick by brick. And I will be the one to make sure that happens." The finality of Kash's words echoed in the room as Judge Hawthorne remained frozen, his reputation in tatters. The power had shifted. What began as a planned political spectacle had turned into an unprecedented moment of accountability. As the cameras rolled and the truth settled in, it became clear to everyone in the room that the game had changed. Kash Patel wasn't just holding the judge accountable, he was holding the entire system accountable, and there was no turning back. The live broadcast cut to a commercial break, but the damage had already been done. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kash Patel sat calmly, collecting his thoughts, while Judge Hawthorne remained seated, pale and trembling, his face a mask of disbelief and defeat. The panelists, who had been poised to ask their questions, now sat in stunned silence, their roles rendered insignificant in the wake of Kash's revelations. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Producers scrambled to contact the network's legal team. There had been no script for this. No one had anticipated Kash Patel's relentless precision in dismantling the carefully crafted facade of Judge Hawthorne's career. The shockwaves rippled out, not just in the studio, but across every media outlet, social platform, and courtroom in the country. But Kash wasn't looking for applause or acknowledgement. This moment wasn't about his personal victory, it was about accountability. He had known that exposing the truth would be uncomfortable for many, but he had also known that it was the only way to restore integrity. The truth had a way of working its own kind of power, one that was far more enduring than any political maneuver or judicial manipulation. As the cameras began rolling again, Kash's voice cut through the silence, steady and unyielding. "The conversation we're having today is not about me or Judge Hawthorne. It's about the integrity of the system we all rely on, the system that's been hijacked by people who use it for their own political advantage. You've all seen the evidence. What are we going to do about it?" Judge Hawthorne's face flushed as he finally found his voice, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is a travesty. You've turned a legitimate forum into a smear campaign. These documents you've presented are out of context. You can't just accuse me based on half-truths and speculative motives." Kash didn't flinch. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the judge. "I didn't just present half-truths, Your Honor. I presented facts. And you can try to spin them however you like, but the truth is irrefutable." Kash paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "You've manipulated the judicial process for years to protect your political allies. And now the truth is in front of you, laid bare for the American people to see." The judge's attempt to mount a defense seemed more desperate by the second. But Kash was ready for this moment. He had prepared for it for months, if not years. The documents in front of him weren't just pieces of paper. They were the proof of a broken system, a system he was determined to fix. "Here's the thing, Your Honor," Kash continued, his tone growing more pointed. "The reason this forum exists in the first place is because the people have lost faith in the system. They've seen it corrupted by people like you who hide behind legal jargon and political influence to silence those who challenge you. But now, with all due respect, the people don't need your defense. They need accountability. The camera zoomed in on Kash's face, his calm expression now more resolute than ever. This wasn't just a confrontation between two individuals. It was a confrontation between the people's trust and the people who had abused that trust for far too long. For the first time, Judge Hawthorne faltered. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but found none. The panelists, once ready to criticize Kash's leadership, now sat frozen in place, unable to deny the obvious truth. The audience, too, seemed caught in a collective breath, sensing the historic shift that was unfolding before them. Kash Patel wasn't just exposing corruption in one judge. He was exposing a system that had long been built to protect the powerful at the expense of the people. And that system was now under scrutiny like never before. As the tension in the room grew, Kash continued, "What we're talking about today isn't about political warfare or ideological battles. This is about justice, real justice. The kind that doesn't discriminate. The kind that doesn't play favorites. And the kind that holds those in power accountable for their actions." Judge Hawthorne opened his mouth, likely to make another attempt at defense, but Kash held up a hand, stopping him. "I've given you the floor, Your Honor. But now the time for talking is over. We all know the truth. The question is, what will we do about it?" There was a pause. The judge's mouth worked as though he wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His previous confidence, built on years of manipulating the system, had vanished. Kash Patel had shattered it with the simplicity of truth. Kash turned his gaze to the panel. The truth doesn't need to be debated. It needs to be acted upon. Now, I ask all of you, publicly and on the record, what are you going to do about the system we've just exposed? The camera caught every shift in the room. The silence had become suffocating. The studio, once an arena for political theater, had now become a battleground for something far more significant: accountability. Kash Patel wasn't just waiting for an answer from the panel. He wasn't looking for a soundbite or a headline. He was waiting for something more important: action. The kind of action that would finally begin to restore the integrity that had been stripped away by people like Judge Hawthorne. The kind of action that would signal to the nation that the truth had a place in their courts, their government, and their society. Finally, one of the panelists, a senator who had initially seemed skeptical of Kash's reforms, cleared his throat. "Director Patel, I believe we need to further investigate these claims. The integrity of the system demands it." Kash nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his gaze. This was only the beginning. What mattered now was the follow-through. What mattered was ensuring that the reforms he had set in motion didn't stop with this hearing, but continued into every corner of the system, from the FBI to the courts themselves. "We will follow through," Kash said. "But the real work begins now." The camera pulled back, capturing the silence in the room as Kash Patel stood up, his work done for now. He had exposed the truth, but the question that hung in the air was whether the system would have the courage to face it. The stage was set. The players were in position. And now, the real test would begin. In the days following the televised forum, Kash Patel became a figure of national conversation. News outlets scrambled to cover the explosive revelations, but the story was no longer just about the clash between a federal judge and the new FBI director. It was about something far deeper: a battle over the integrity of the justice system itself. The power structures that had long been shielded by secrecy were now being exposed for the world to see. And for the first time in a long while, people were talking about accountability. In Washington, D.C., Kash was hard at work behind the scenes, not basking in the aftermath of his televised takedown of Judge Isaac Hawthorne, but instead pushing forward with the reforms he had promised. The public shock was still fresh, but Kash knew that the momentum would only last if real, concrete changes were made. His mission wasn't just to tear down the corrupted institutions, it was to rebuild them. As part of his ongoing efforts, Kash had ordered a comprehensive internal audit of the FBI. He wanted transparency not just for the public, but for the agency itself. Corruption had festered inside the system for years, and it wasn't enough to simply expose it. It needed to be eradicated at its root. The FBI, with all its resources and intelligence, would have to be refashioned into a beacon of accountability, and it would start with the most difficult task of all: rooting out those who had allowed political influence to infiltrate their ranks. Meanwhile, across the country, the fallout from the forum was reaching its peak. Judge Hawthorne, once a towering figure in the judicial world, was now a pariah. His resignation wasn't official yet, but the pressure was mounting. His colleagues in the judiciary, once loyal to him, began distancing themselves, and whispers of his corruption had spread beyond the courtroom. The political and media elites who had once admired him now found themselves scrambling to maintain their support for a man whose reputation had disintegrated in front of millions. But it wasn't just Judge Hawthorne who was feeling the heat. Kash Patel's actions had started a larger conversation about the weaponization of power within government institutions. Across the country, citizens, journalists, and activists were calling for greater transparency, for a reckoning with the corrupt practices that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. Kash had sparked a movement, a quiet but determined call for reform in all areas of government, from law enforcement to the courts. Inside the FBI, Kash's reforms were being implemented, but not without resistance. Some agents, especially those with long ties to the old guard, were uncomfortable with the sudden shift. It wasn't just about cleaning up corruption. It was about changing the very culture of the agency. Kash had removed regional chiefs and replaced them with individuals committed to the values of transparency and integrity. He had opened up communication channels between different divisions, ensuring that no corner of the agency was exempt from scrutiny. Yet, even within his own ranks, there were whispers. Some believed Kash was too radical, too quick to burn down the old system. But Kash wasn't worried. He had seen firsthand how corruption could grow in the shadows of power, and he knew that the price of cleaning house was worth the cost. He'd spent his career fighting to expose the truth, and now, as the head of the FBI, he had the power to ensure that truth would never again be hidden. On the day Kash issued the new transparency protocols, there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air. The office buzzed with nervous energy as agents and staff members processed the news. These new protocols were unprecedented, clear rules that required all future intelligence coordination between federal agencies and the judiciary to be open and documented. It was the first step in a larger plan to eliminate the backdoor deals and undisclosed political influence that had poisoned the FBI for so long. But Kash's attention wasn't solely on the bureaucracy. He was keenly aware that the fight for integrity wasn't just about changing processes or policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. He knew that real reform would take time, and that the most powerful weapon at his disposal was the truth. He made it a point to personally meet with young recruits, FBI agents fresh out of training, to make sure they understood what they were signing up for. This was more than just a job. It was a responsibility to protect the trust of the American people and to fight against a system that had long been corrupted. One afternoon, as he walked through the halls of the FBI headquarters, he saw a group of new recruits gathered in a meeting room, their eyes trained on a screen. The video playing was of Kash himself, speaking at the televised forum, calmly dismantling Judge Hawthorne's career. The recruits were watching with rapt attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and awe. Kash entered the room quietly, and for a moment, the recruits didn't notice him. When they finally saw him standing in the doorway, there was a brief moment of hesitation, but then, one by one, they stood. It wasn't just a show of respect. It was a silent acknowledgement that they understood what Kash had done and why it mattered. He wasn't just a director. He was a symbol of a new era in law enforcement, an era where integrity came before politics. Kash walked up to the screen, pausing for a moment to look at the image of himself standing before Judge Hawthorne. He turned to the recruits. "You're here to make a difference," he said, his voice steady and confident. "You're here to uphold the Constitution, not to protect political careers. What you saw on that screen, that's what happens when you stand up for what's right. It's not easy, but it's necessary. This isn't about winning for yourself. It's about winning for the truth." The recruits, still standing, nodded in unison. They understood. Kash Patel's quiet revolution was about to begin, and they would be the ones carrying it forward. Meanwhile, across the country, the ripple effect of the televised hearing continued to shake the halls of power. Judge Hawthorne's resignation was now inevitable, but as his name faded from the public eye, a new narrative was being written, a narrative in which truth, not power, was the central force. As Kash Patel moved forward with his reforms, the fight was far from over. The truth he had uncovered was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in changing a system that had been built on lies, secrecy, and manipulation. But Kash Patel wasn't afraid. He had already shown that with enough determination, no system, no matter how powerful, could stand in the way of the truth. The days following the televised forum felt like a blur to Kash Patel. His role as the newly appointed director of the FBI was no longer just about overseeing operations. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been eroded by years of corruption and political influence. The battle for integrity was far from over, and as the public's scrutiny remained intense, Kash's resolve only strengthened. Behind closed doors, however, the work was just beginning. The changes Kash had set in motion inside the FBI had created a ripple effect across government agencies. The old guard, entrenched in a system of secrecy, was beginning to push back. There were murmurs of discontent within the agency, whispers of agents who feared Kash's reforms were too radical. But Kash wasn't concerned. He knew that no real change could occur without resistance. The road to transparency was never easy, especially when those benefiting from the status quo had the most to lose. He had faced worse challenges before, and this would be no different. What mattered now was that the truth had been exposed, and the system would never be the same again. It was early in the morning when Kash entered his office at FBI headquarters. The office was quiet, more than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the city outside was still waking up. As he sat behind his desk, he looked out the window at the rising sun, a symbol of the new day he was ushering in. He had a full day ahead of him, but for a moment, he allowed himself a brief pause. Then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Director Patel, the voice on the other end said. It was deep, clipped, and professional. This is a follow-up from the investigation into Judge Isaac Hawthorne. We've received the full, declassified report from your internal review, and there's an immediate need for action. Kash's heart skipped a beat. He knew this was coming. The investigation into Hawthorne, while publicly a huge blow to his career, was just the beginning. There were countless others who had been involved in the network of corruption. The fallout from Hawthorne's resignation was only the tip of the iceberg. I'm listening, Kash replied, his voice steady. The report outlines 27 separate instances of judicial coordination with political advocacy groups. We've confirmed their involvement in political campaigns dating back to 2010. The scope is wider than we originally anticipated. The question is, what happens next? Kash exhaled slowly, his mind already running through the possibilities. It's time for a full audit of the judiciary. We'll need to ensure that all the cases influenced by these actions are revisited. The people involved, whether they were aware or not, need to be held accountable. A pause followed before the voice responded, understood. We're preparing a referral to the Inspector General. We'll need your full backing. I'll give it, Kash said without hesitation. We'll clean this mess up, one piece at a time. But we'll do it right. The conversation ended, but the weight of it lingered in the air. The scope of what Kash had begun was far beyond a single judge or even a single case. He was cleaning up a broken system, and it would take time, patience, and the unwavering dedication he had built his entire career on. The days blurred into weeks, and Kash's reforms began to take root, both within the FBI and across the government. The public, still reeling from the explosive revelations about Judge Hawthorne, now began to see real action. Whistleblower protections were bolstered, and transparency protocols became the new standard across all federal agencies. Kash's office became a hub for truth seekers, citizens who had once been afraid to speak out, whistleblowers who had been silenced, and agents who had long seen the rot but never had the power to do anything about it. They all came to him, each story more damning than the last. The full scope of corruption began to come into sharper focus, and with each new revelation, Kash's resolve grew. It wasn't enough to expose the truth. Now, the real challenge was rebuilding the institutions that had been compromised for so long. And it wasn't just about fixing the FBI, it was about fixing the entire system. Kash spent weeks meeting with legal experts, reform advocates, and government officials. He had a plan, a vision for a new era of transparency and accountability. But it was going to take more than policy changes. It was going to take a cultural shift within the very institutions that had protected the corrupt for so long. One evening, as Kash prepared for yet another meeting, a knock came at his door. He looked up to see his assistant standing in the doorway, holding a file. "Director, there's something you'll want to see," she said, handing him the file. Kash opened it. The contents were a series of documents, emails, and text exchanges between federal judges, political consultants, and law enforcement officials. What stood out was the timing. Their efforts to block certain investigations, the coordinated attacks on journalists, and the well-orchestrated suppression of whistleblower reports. Kash's fingers tightened around the file as he read through the evidence. This wasn't just a problem with one judge or a few bad apples. It was systemic. "This goes deeper than we thought," Kash muttered, already processing the next steps. "We need to go after the entire system." Months passed, and the investigations continued. The evidence built, and the ripple effect Kash had started spread across the entire government. What had been a single spark of accountability had now turned into a raging fire of reform. Then, one day, Kash received a call from an unexpected source, a senator who had once been an opponent of his reforms. The senator, his voice filled with begrudging respect, said, "Director Patel, I wanted to personally thank you. Your reforms are changing the way we view justice in this country. You've set a new standard. We're ready to work with you." Kash didn't respond immediately. He had expected resistance, but now, as the tide began to shift, he realized that his fight for justice was no longer a solo endeavor. He had garnered allies, not just in the government, but among the people who were tired of the same old game being played. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Kash Patel met with a group of high-ranking FBI agents in his office. The room was filled with men and women who had once been wary of his reforms but now stood united behind him. "We've done it," Kash said, his voice steady. "The system is changing. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast. But we've set a precedent, and we won't stop until justice is restored." With that, Kash turned to the file on his desk, the last piece of evidence from Judge Hawthorne's reign, now part of an investigation that would lead to even higher echelons of power. He knew the work wasn't over, but he also knew that the road ahead was brighter, clearer, and paved with the truth. As Kash Patel stood there, looking out at the city below, he understood that this moment was only the beginning. The truth had been exposed, and now it was time to finish what he had started, to make sure that no one could ever again misuse the law for personal or political gain. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Kash Patel, the man who had stared down power and refused to back down, would be there every step of the way.